When you close your eyes and think of a Viking, what drifts into your mind? Perhaps a massive, grimy warrior with matted hair and a horned helmet. Someone who'd rather raid a monastery than read a poem. For centuries we've painted the Vikings as Europe's ultimate barbarians, the boogeyman of the medieval world. Yet the picture we've held onto is wonderfully, fascinatingly incomplete. What if I told you that the average Viking was probably the cleanest, best-groomed person in medieval Europe? That they were so devoted to their appearance. They literally bleached their beards and spent more time on their hair than anyone else of their era. What if I told you that Viking society had legally recognised poetry battles, where a devastating verse could destroy your reputation more thoroughly than any sword? The truth about the Vikings is far stranger, and far more enchanting than the stereotype. These weren't just raiders. They were a people who took their grooming so seriously that English chroniclers complained they were winning hearts with their devastatingly good hygiene. They had gods specifically for skiing. They could navigate through fog using what they believed were magic crystals. And remarkably, it actually worked. They even had laws that let you divorce your husband if he committed the unforgivable crime of wearing a shirt with too low a neckline. And yes, that's a detail recorded in their ancient laws. So find a comfortable position, let your breathing slow, and allow the sounds of a crackling longhouse fire and the distant Nordic winds to carry you back in time to the real world of the Vikings. We're about to meet the real Norsemen, the ones who spent their Saturdays in warm baths, who settled disputes with poetic competitions, and who brought cats on their ships as guardians and companions. This is the story of the most misunderstood people in history, and the reality is far more fascinating than the myth. Let's gently set aside that image of the dirty, unkempt Viking warrior. As we sift through the archaeological record, something remarkable emerges. The Vikings were devoted to being clean, deeply, almost ritually devoted. Archaeologists excavating Viking graves from the 9th century expected to find weapons, perhaps some jewellery, the usual warrior gear. What they discovered instead tells a different story entirely. Combs, tweezers, razors, ear spoons. Delicate little scoops specifically designed for removing earwax. These aren't the grave goods of barbarians. They're the careful collection of someone who valued personal care. These weren't simple utilitarian tools either. Many combs were works of art, intricately carved from bone or antler, stored in decorative cases like treasured possessions. They featured both coarse teeth for arranging hair and incredibly fine teeth for a less glamorous but essential purpose, removing lice. Even in the cleanest households of medieval Europe, lice were an unwelcome reality. The Vikings wove cleanliness into the very fabric of their week. You know how we have Sunday from the sun's day, and Monday from the moon's day? The Old Norse word for Saturday was logadag, literally washing day or bath day. They had made weekly bathing part of their calendar's rhythm. While most Europeans might bathe once or twice a year, the Vikings were there every single week, letting the warm water wash away the week's labours. Imagine the scene on a Saturday evening. The air is thick with warm steam, smelling of damp wood, clean water, and perhaps a hint of birch leaves. The low murmur of conversations echoes through the bathhouse, a gentle sound beneath the splash of water. This wasn't just about getting clean. It was about feeling the warmth seep into your bones after a long week in the cold fields. Or on the windy sea, entire communities would gather, sharing news, making agreements, finding comfort in the communal ritual of cleansing. Now we have a curious complaint about Viking hygiene, preserved in the writings of John of Wallingford, a 13th century English chronicler. He's not complaining that the Vikings were dirty, quite the opposite. He writes with barely concealed alarm that the Danes will want, after the fashion of their country, to comb their hair every day, to bathe every Saturday, to change their garments often, and set off their persons by many frivolous devices. Frivolous devices. Such delightful indignation. and it continues. In this matter they laid siege to the virtue of the married woman, and persuaded the daughters even of the noble to be their concubines. It's a charmingly flustered complaint, really. He's observing with a touch of panic that the local English nobles, perhaps not as dedicated to their weekly bathing, were losing the game of courtship to these newcomers with their fine combs and fresh linens. The Vikings weren't winning hearts through violence or intimidation, but through the simple, powerful appeal of being impeccably clean. The Viking approach to hair care reveals another layer of their sophisticated grooming culture. They crafted a special soap with an incredibly high lye content, a harsh, caustic mixture that served a dual purpose. This wasn't merely for cleaning, it was a deliberate beauty treatment. The ideal Viking look included golden hair, shining like wheat in the summer sun. Those not blessed with naturally light hair had this chemical option. The high lye soap would gradually bleach dark hair to honey gold, or even a rich reddish hue. Arab travellers who encountered Viking traders described their beards as saffron yellow, clearly transformed by this careful chemical process. Yet this harsh soap offered another benefit. While it lightened their hair, it also eliminated lice, those persistent companions of medieval life. Fashion and function merged in one treatment, though it likely stung the scalp and reddened the skin. Beauty, as always, demanded its small sacrifices. This devotion to cleanliness and appearance flowed through every level of Viking society. Common farmers' graves contained grooming kits alongside their tools. Children were taught to comb their hair daily. Even in the humblest dwelling, you'd find these implements of personal care, suggesting a culture that valued presentation as much as prowess. The evidence paints a picture far removed from our assumptions. The Vikings weren't the unwashed masses storming civilized Europe. They were meticulous about their appearance, understanding that cleanliness was both a personal pleasure and a social grace. They transformed the act of bathing from necessity into ritual, from chore into community. The English nobility didn't fear Viking axes nearly as much as they feared Viking allure, and perhaps that tells us everything we need to know about who truly understood the art of living well. Consider what archaeologists call the Viking grooming kit, though perhaps we might better imagine it as a treasured collection of personal implements. Those graves filled with combs and tweezers tell us something profound. Vikings carried these items everywhere, often in specially crafted cases attached to their belts. Each morning brought its rituals. The careful combing, the precise plucking of stray hairs, the patient shaping of beards into their desired forms. The tweezers weren't for emergencies, but for daily maintenance. Vikings sculpted their facial hair with an artist's attention, creating styles that required constant care. Those ear spoons came in different sizes and patterns, some decorated with delicate engravings. Even the mundane act of ear cleaning became an opportunity for beauty and craftsmanship. The pursuit of the perfect golden look transformed Viking settlements into something resembling distributed beauty salons. That high lye soap process was likely uncomfortable. Lye is caustic enough to burn skin, yet across Scandinavia, men and women endured it regularly. The desired result was hair that seemed to capture sunlight itself, beards that glowed with an almost otherworldly golden sheen. Genetic studies reveal that Viking Age Scandinavia contained plenty of diversity. Brown hair, black hair, every shade nature provides. Yet when Ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat, encountered Viking traders along the Volga River, he marvelled at their uniformly golden appearance, those saffron yellow beards that caught the light like precious metal. Women participated in this chemical artistry too, sometimes adding minerals to achieve different shades. Red was particularly prized, a deep, rich auburn that required specific ingredients and techniques. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age settlements shows traces of these treatments in the soil around communal washing areas, like fingerprints of ancient beauty rituals. While pursuing fashion, they were inadvertently solving one of medieval Europe's most persistent problems. Head lice plagued everyone from peasants to kings, spreading disease and causing endless discomfort. The Vikings' harsh chemical treatments created an environment where lice simply couldn't survive. Every beauty treatment was also a delousing session, every fashion choice a health intervention. In Viking society, appearance directly reflected one's place in the world. Clean-styled hair announced that you possessed both time and resources for self-care. Bleached hair showed you could afford expensive ingredients. Intricate braids and beard styles demonstrated either your own skilled hands or your ability to employ someone with such talents. The sagas overflow with loving descriptions of beautiful hair and magnificent beards. Heroes are portrayed in exquisite detail, the exact shade of their locks, the way their beards were braided, how the light played across their golden hair. Poor grooming, conversely, marked someone as having abandoned civilized life. The sagas speak of mockery aimed at those with tangled hair or unkempt beards, treating such neglect as a form of social death. Wherever Vikings travelled, local chroniclers noticed their appearance. In Ireland, they observed Viking men wearing kohl around their eyes, likely adopted from Middle Eastern trading partners. In France, they noted how Vikings wore their finest clothes even for everyday activities, not reserving them for special occasions. Each observation adds another layer to our understanding of a people who saw every day as worthy of their best presentation. This attention to appearance created ripples across Europe. In areas under Viking influence, archaeological finds show grooming tools becoming more common, bathing frequency increasing, and hairstyles shifting to match Nordic fashions. The Vikings weren't merely arriving, they were influencing, setting trends that would persist for generations. The Viking transformation was complete. They had turned personal hygiene into artistry, chemical hair treatment into common practice, and somehow convinced much of Europe that enduring lye burns for beauty was perfectly reasonable. Yet looking magnificent was only part of navigating Viking society. You also needed to master the complex social rules, to understand when words could wound more than weapons, and to know that even your clothing choices could have legal consequences. Picture the scene in a great hall on a winter evening. The central fire casts long, dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The air's heavy with the scent of mead and wood smoke, thick enough to taste. The assembled crowd falls into an expectant hush as two figures rise from their benches. They stand facing each other, but they carry no weapons. At least, not the kind made of iron. This is flighting, the Viking art of competitive poetry, where words could cut deeper than any blade. This wasn't casual mockery or simple name-calling. This was a formal performance, a duel of wit and memory where combatants traded elaborate, often rhyming insults, before an audience who would judge the winner based on creativity, cleverness, and devastating accuracy. The most famous example comes from the gods themselves, in the poem called Lokasenna, Loki's Flighting. The story tells of Loki arriving uninvited at a feast, then systematically dismantling every god and goddess present with carefully crafted accusations. When Idun attempts to make peace, Loki responds with measured cruelty. "Be silent, Idun. Of all women I declare thee most fond of men, since thou thy arms carefully washed, didst twine round thy brother's murderer." Feel the weight of those words hanging in the mead-scented air. This wasn't considered barbaric behaviour. It was high art, the ability to craft such devastating verses spontaneously. Maintaining poetic metre while unravelling your opponent's reputation thread by thread was a skill Vikings deeply admired. Great flighters were remembered for generations, their best lines becoming part of the cultural memory. The rules were intricate and unforgiving. Your insults needed to be clever, preferably with layers of meaning. They had to rest on at least plausible foundations. Pure fabrication would backfire. Most critically, they had to maintain proper poetic structure. A stumble over words or a break in metre meant immediate defeat. Sometimes, though, words alone couldn't settle matters. When honour had been wounded too deeply for poetry to heal, Vikings turned to the holmgang, literally island-going. Yet this wasn't the chaotic violence we might expect. Feel the cool, damp air of the small island, the holm, where such duels took place. A heavy cloak is stretched upon the ground, its edges carefully pegged down, marking the boundaries of this sacred space. Perhaps 9 feet square, no more. The morning mist still clings to the grass beyond this defined arena. The rules were as rigid and respected as the iron of their swords. Each fighter received 3 shields. When one shattered, you moved to the next. The challenge party took the first blow. Step outside the cloak's boundary with both feet, and you forfeit not just the duel but your honour. Most remarkably, the fight often ended with first blood. As soon as crimson touched the dark wool of the cloak, the matter was settled. The loser paid a fine, the holmlausen, and life continued. Consider the most fascinating prohibition. If you fell into a berserker rage, if you bit your shield in fury, you automatically lost. The Vikings, those supposed savage warriors, had institutionalized emotional control into their combat laws. Losing your temper meant losing your honour. But the ultimate expression of Viking lore wasn't found on the dueling field. Picture a wide green field under an open sky, perhaps in a valley sheltered by ancient hills. Here the entire community gathers for the thing, their open-air parliament. This wasn't a gathering of kings and lords dictating to subjects, but an assembly of free people, farmers, traders, craftsmen, coming together to shape their society. Feel the gentle wind carrying voices across the field as issues are debated openly, publicly, where every free person has the right to speak. At the centre stands the law speaker, chosen for their extraordinary memory and wisdom. Listen as their voice rises and falls with the cadence of ancient words, reciting the entire legal code from memory, every law, every precedent, every tradition that binds the community together. The thing met regularly, perhaps at the full moon when travel was easier, or at specific times throughout the year. In Iceland, the Althing gathered every summer at Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley where the European and North American continental plates meet, as if the very earth itself was opening to hear their deliberations. These assemblies could last for days, or even weeks. Disputes were heard, marriages arranged, trade agreements negotiated, new laws were proposed and debated, the guilty were sentenced, the innocent cleared. All of it happening not in some dark hall or secret chamber, but under the endless Nordic sky, witnessed by the entire community. This was the true heart of Viking society. Not the violence of raids or the glory of battle, but this deep, abiding belief in law spoken aloud, in community consensus, in the power of collective wisdom. While much of Europe was ruled by the sword and the crown, the Vikings were governing themselves through debate and memory, through tradition and collective agreement. Now we come to one of the most unexpected aspects of Viking law, the rights of women. In this warrior culture, women could own land, run businesses, and most remarkably, initiate divorce. The grounds for divorce were surprisingly diverse, and sometimes delightfully specific. According to the Gragas, Iceland's medieval law code, a woman could legally separate from her husband if he wore a shirt cut so low that it exposed his nipples or chest hair. Such a garment was considered cross-dressing, wearing women's clothing, bringing shame upon the household. The law worked both ways. A man could divorce his wife if she wore trousers. The Laxdæla saga preserves a tale of calculated fashion sabotage. A woman named Thorda deliberately sews her husband a shirt with an extremely low neckline. When he wears it in public, She immediately files for divorce on the grounds of his inappropriate dress. The law sides with her. Imagine the hushed conversations in the longhouse that evening. The mixture of shock and admiration at such clever manipulation of the legal code. This might seem absurd through modern eyes, yet it reveals something profound about Viking society. They had created elaborate systems to regulate behaviour, to channel conflict, to protect individual rights. A woman wasn't powerless. She was the guardian of her household's honour, with legal authority to defend it. The Vikings had transformed conflict resolution into sophisticated art. Verbal duelling for minor disputes, regulated combat for serious ones, and legal frameworks that protected individual dignity, including the right not to be married to someone with questionable fashion sense. These weren't lawless barbarians. They were a people who loved rules so much they had specifications for everything. The size of dueling grounds, the structure of insult poetry, the acceptable depth of a neckline. They'd made law into culture, and culture into law. As complex as their social world was, their mastery of the physical world was equally impressive. They could glide across frozen landscapes like spirits, navigate through impenetrable fog, and somehow convince cats that crossing the North Atlantic was a splendid idea. Imagine the profound silence of a Scandinavian forest in deep winter. The world is blanketed in white, muffled and hushed, where even whispers seem too loud. The only sound is the soft shush of skis gliding over fresh powder, and the crisp bite of cold air in your lungs. Through this crystalline quietness, a lone figure moves with impossible grace, weaving between snow-laden pines as if dancing with the landscape itself. Skiing in Scandinavia stretches back into the mists of prehistory. Archaeological fragments from Russia date to 6,700 BCE. Older than the pyramids, older than writing, older than most of what we call civilization. By the Viking Age, Scandinavians had been perfecting this technology for literally thousands of years. The oldest intact Nordic skis, preserved in Swedish and Norwegian bogs, date to around 3,200 BCE. Recently, melting ice on Mount Diggervarden in Norway revealed something remarkable. A complete pair of 1,300-year-old skis with their leather binding still attached, as if their owner had just stepped away from them moments ago. The Vikings revered skiing enough to give it a god. Ulla, deity of winter, hunting and skiing, was depicted gliding across the snow with his bow, ready to hunt in that white silence. The prose Edda describes him as so skilled that none could compete with him. For Vikings, skiing wasn't recreation but survival. How you hunted in winter, how you travelled between settlements, how you moved through a world that others found impassable. They crafted different skis for different purposes. Pine for everyday travel, birch for speed. They developed an asymmetrical system where one ski was longer for gliding and one shorter for pushing. They discovered how pine tar applied to the bottom could make the skis whisper across the snow rather than stick to it. Now, let us move from the white silence of winter forests to the grey uncertainty of the open sea. Viking longships were capable of crossing vast stretches of open ocean, but the North Atlantic is often shrouded in fog so thick you cannot see the bow of your own ship. How did they navigate when the sun was invisible, when the stars were hidden? The sagas speak of the solar stain, the sunstone. For years, scholars dismissed this as fantasy, another piece of Viking magic that belonged in mythology, not history. Then someone decided to test whether such a thing could actually work. Think of a navigator on the deck of a longship, the world around him a featureless grey void. He holds the sunstone up to the pale sky, a piece of Iceland spar, clear calcite crystal that looks almost ordinary. As he slowly rotates it, something remarkable happens. A faint ghostly pattern appears within the crystal, shifting and changing with each turn. He continues rotating until the pattern suddenly snaps into clarity. In that moment of stillness, He knows precisely where the hidden sun lies. This wasn't magic, but physics. Though to the Vikings, perhaps there was no difference. The crystal was detecting polarized light patterns invisible to the naked eye. Patterns that form around the sun even when it's completely obscured. Modern experiments confirm that a skilled navigator could locate the sun within a few degrees of accuracy, even in heavy cloud or when the sun had set below the horizon. The medieval saga Hrádolfsstaðr describes King Olaf testing a navigator during a snowstorm. The navigator uses his sunstone and makes his prediction, and when they check, he is exactly right. What seemed like sorcery was actually sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena that wouldn't be scientifically explained for another 1,000 years. On those long voyages, Vikings had another essential companion, one connected to their most beloved goddess. Freya, deity of love, fertility and war, was said to ride in a chariot pulled by 2 enormous cats. Surely the most magnificent and unlikely divine transport ever imagined. This divine connection meant that the cats padding silently through a longship's hold were more than mere mouses. Picture them, sleek forms moving through the darkness below deck, eyes glowing green in the shadows. The soft vibration of a purr felt through the wooden planks, mixing with the creak of timbers and the endless song of waves. These were living symbols of divine protection, their presence a blessing from Freya herself. Newlyweds received kittens as wedding gifts, invoking the goddess's favour on their household. Practically speaking, cats hunted the rats and mice that would otherwise devour precious food supplies. But in the Viking worldview, nothing was merely practical. These small hunters were divine guardians, comfort in the endless grey of the sea, reminders of hearth and home during those long, cold voyages into the unknown. Genetic studies have traced the spread of domestic cats across Europe, and the trail follows Viking trade routes with remarkable precision. Everywhere the Vikings went, cats followed, carried in their ships as protectors, companions, and perhaps as living prayers to Freya for safe passage home. The Vikings didn't separate the practical from the spiritual. A ski wasn't just a tool, but a connection to Eula. A crystal wasn't just a navigation aid, but a window into hidden truths. A cat wasn't just pest control, but a divine guardian padding softly through their lives. Through mastery of these technologies and relationships, the Vikings transformed the harshest environments on Earth into highways and homes. Where others saw barriers, they saw opportunities. Where others found death, they found life. Speaking of death, there's one aspect of Viking culture that we've completely misunderstood. Their vision of the afterlife. Because it turns out, not every Viking was dreaming of Valhalla. As twilight settles over our journey through Viking culture, we come to perhaps the greatest misconception of all. Close your eyes and drift with me into the Viking understanding of what comes after, and prepare to have everything you thought you knew gently dissolved like morning mist. Most Vikings didn't go to Valhalla. In fact, most Vikings didn't even particularly want to go to Valhalla. The popular image of every Norse warrior desperately seeking a glorious death in battle to earn their place in Odin's golden hall is a story we've told ourselves, not one the Vikings told. Valhalla, as described in the ancient texts, was Odin's hall in Asgard. The Einherjar, those who died in battle, would feast and fight there until Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. Each day they would battle to the death. Each evening they would be resurrected to feast on the boar Sehrimnir and drink mead flowing from the udder of the goat Heidrun. Yet entry to this warrior's paradise was remarkably exclusive. You had to die in combat, not from disease after a lifetime of battles, not from an accident, not peacefully in your bed surrounded by grandchildren. Only those who fell with weapon in hand, in the midst of actual fighting, could enter those doors. Even then, you had merely a 50-50 chance. According to the Grimnismal, Odin received only half the battle dead. The other half went to Freya's hall, Folkvanga, a realm barely mentioned in the sources but apparently equally prestigious. Imagine dying the perfect warrior's death, only to have your destination decided by what amounts to a cosmic coin flip. For everyone else, farmers, traders, craftsmen, women, children, and warriors who died in their beds, the destination was Helheim, the realm of Hel, Loki's daughter. Before Christian writers got their hands on these stories, Helheim wasn't a place of punishment. It wasn't fire and torment. It was simply where most people went. The earlier sources describe Helheim as a quiet realm beneath the world, cool and misty, where the dead continued a shadowy version of their earthly existence. Neither paradise nor punishment, just continuation, like an eternal Nordic autumn, grey and calm, and neither particularly pleasant nor particularly terrible. The proof that Helheim wasn't Viking hell lies in who went there. When Balder, most beloved of all the gods, beautiful and good and innocent, is killed through treachery, he goes to Helheim, not Valhalla, not Folkvanga, but the same destination as farmers and merchants. If Helheim were a place of damnation, why would the best of the gods reside there? The Viking afterlife was sorted by manner of death, not moral judgment. It was a classification system, not a reward structure. Warriors who died in battle went to warrior afterlives. Everyone else went to the general afterlife. Those who drowned might go to the sea goddess Ran's hall beneath the waves. It was practical, almost bureaucratic in its organisation. This system reveals something profound about Viking values. They didn't divide the world into saved and damned, good and evil. A farmer who lived honourably and died peacefully wasn't punished for avoiding battle. He simply went to the appropriate afterlife for farmers who died peacefully. Consider what Valhalla actually offered. Yes, there was eternal feasting and fighting, but the Einherjar weren't there for pleasure. They were training for Ragnarok, the final battle where they would march out with Odin to fight the forces of chaos and lose. The prophecies were clear. The gods would fall, the warriors would die again, permanently this time, and the world would end. You'd spend eternity preparing for a battle you were destined to lose. Compare that to Helheim, where you'd reunite with your ancestors, continue some version of your existence, and avoid any cosmic battles against impossible odds. For a Viking farmer or merchant, which afterlife sounds more appealing? By the time Christian scribes recorded these stories, they couldn't resist imposing their own framework. Snorri Sturluson, writing in the 13th century, added details to Helheim that sound suspiciously like Christian hell. Halls of misery, tables set with hunger. Modern scholars recognise these as later additions, attempts to force Norse cosmology into a Christian model of reward and punishment. The complex, thoughtful Viking afterlife system, where death was a transition to an appropriate continuation rather than a judgment, was flattened into a simple binary that never existed in the original beliefs. 1,000 years of misunderstanding crystallised into the myth that Vikings were death-obsessed warriors desperate for Valhalla. The truth is gentler and more sophisticated. The Vikings had created an afterlife that reflected their complex society. Warriors had their place, but so did everyone else. Death wasn't a moral judgment, but a doorway to the appropriate next chapter of existence. And so our journey through the true world of the Vikings comes to its gentle close, not the filthy, mindless barbarians of our imagination, but a people so devoted to cleanliness they bathed in warm, birch-scented water every week. Not lawless raiders, but a society with elaborate codes governing everything from the structure of poetry to the acceptable cut of a neckline, where free people gathered under open skies to debate their laws and shape their communities together. These were people who glided through winter forests on skis blessed by gods, who held crystals to clouded skies and found hidden suns, who carried purring guardians across storm-tossed seas. They created a mythology where different lives led to different afterlives, where farmers were as valued as warriors, where death was a transition, not a judgment. The Vikings were artists of necessity, transforming harsh requirements into beautiful rituals. They made bathing a social sacrament, grooming a daily art, and somehow convinced the world that chemically burning your hair was the height of sophistication. They developed technologies that seemed like magic, created legal frameworks that protected individual dignity, and built communities where the voice of a farmer could be heard alongside that of a warrior at the Thing. Were they violent? Sometimes, when the world demanded it. Were they raiders? When opportunity called? But they were also poets and lawmakers, democratic debaters and memory keepers, innovators and explorers, careful groomers and devoted cat companions. They were complex, contradictory, and far more fascinating than any simple story could capture. The grimy barbarian of legend dissolves like morning frost in sunlight, replaced by a people both strange and strangely familiar. They were stylish and sophisticated, with habits and concerns that echo across the centuries. They believed you could lose your honour for losing your temper, your marriage for a fashion mistake, and that clean hair and clever words were as important as sharp steel. As you drift towards sleep, remember the Saturday bathers, the crystal navigators, the ski-blessed wanderers. Remember the men who bleached their beards, and the women who could divorce them for showing too much chest. Remember the cats in the longships, and the gods in the snow. Remember the real Vikings. So much stranger, so much more sophisticated, and so much more human than we ever imagined. Thank you for joining me on this gentle journey beyond the battlefield, and into the surprisingly refined world of the real Vikings. If you enjoyed uncovering these hidden truths, please like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments what other historical mysteries you'd like to explore in the quiet hours. Until next time, remember the real Vikings. So much stranger, so much more sophisticated, and so much more human than we ever imagined. Sleep well.